learners, and welcome to this session on mapping community resources. I'm Dr. Nivedita Narayan from Pradhan. I'm also the adjunct faculty with Charles Sturt University in Australia. I've worked for over 3 decades with livelihoods promotion and in developing methods and approaches to improving rural livelihoods. My particular interest is in training professionals like you who are interested in livelihoods development. In this session, we'll talk about mapping community resources, and we will use a focus on forests, livestock, and people. You might remember the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework that you discussed in an earlier video with Dr. Nitya Rao. We'll use that framework to explore this topic and to introduce common property resources. I hope you will also remember my video titled Facilitating Group Development in Block 1. Both these videos will be very useful as we discuss this topic. Let's revisit Sustainable Livelihoods Framework as a tool which helps us to understand how households and livelihood systems interact with the outside environment. Both environments are important, the natural environment and the policy and institutional contexts in which people live. In this video, we'll discuss what community resources or assets are. Most importantly, dear learners, I would like you to think about this question. The asset base of poor households is much more limited than that of non-poor households. Why do poor people have restricted access to land, to water, natural resources, and to other assets? How does this limit their livelihood options? What can we do through policies and programs to help them overcome such hurdles? These then are the motivation, and what are the specific objectives as we go through this video? 1. We will explore how access to community resources, that is those resources that are not owned privately, can support livelihoods for the poor in normal times and also during crises. More specifically, we will explore examples to understand the role of common property resources and of livelihoods activities in addressing individual, household, and community level vulnerabilities. Let's revisit community resources or assets. These are all often invisible and not discussed. For instance, the assets category that we discussed and the practical assets in Professor Nitya Rao's lecture, those assets most of you must have assumed are privately owned or individually owned. In fact, we may think that all assets are only privately owned, that is owned by individuals. Like natural capital, that is agricultural land in India, is owned by the father and inherited by the children. Or a physical capital such as a tube well in a plot of land is owned by the owner of the land. Let me ask you a question. Who owns the forest? Who owns the ponds? Who owns the river? Who owns the grazing land in the village? Let's discuss the forest just as an example. It may be owned by the forest department and no human may be allowed to enter, so that the animals, the plants and trees are protected from the humans. It may also be owned by the forest department, but specific groups of people may be allowed to enter. For example, villagers from the nearby villages may be allowed to collect twigs for firewood, shrubs for fodder, non-wood forest produce such as mahua and tendu leaves, chironji, gond, tussar cocoons, lac scrapings, etc. But all this will be collected as prescribed by the owner, that is the forest department. Then there are community or communal forests. These are called village forests or panchayat forests, reflecting the fact that the administration and the use of these forests occurs at the village or the panchayat level. Hamlets, villages, and community of villagers may be actually responsible to administer such resources. Who owns the village grazing patch, then the village pond, the river? These assets or natural capitals, as we discussed earlier in the video, are not owned by any one individual. This brings us to social capital, also discussed in this module, dear listeners. The role of groups and communities and institutional arrangements such as panchayats and forest department, etc., become very important as we look at community resources. Community resources then are often called common property resources. And this is how we will refer to them when we go through this video. Some people suggest that those assets which are not private property, all of those can be treated as common property resources. And that resources become a common property when there is a well-defined group of people who have the right to its collective use. Group of users who are a subset of the village. The institutional arrangement for the use of grazing land may be through the panchayats, it may be through the jati or the tribal panchayat, or it may be through village elders or some other group of people. Such common property resources are widespread and often invisible, degraded, and underutilized. Common resources play an important role in the rural economy and benefit its population in a number of ways. I will show you now a clip from the Lahanti Club in Pradhan in Chakai in Bihar to give us a chance to listen to village people whose lives and livelihoods actually depend on common resources in a direct way. City dwellers too depend on common property resources, but not in the same direct way. And this is not what we will talk about in our video.
Abu hor hopon do sidai khon gi da bir ar atu re adi gan nata minak tabuna. Abu wa horok bande ar jom nyu perkritik re nirbhar minaa. Abu hor hopon the do aima lekan jom nyu minak reho bajar rena jom nyu gibon apna reda. Lahanti Club se khon benawakan video madhyam tele badai ochoye pia abo ato ade pase re aima lekan jom nyu barete. Tobe tihin do dela bon nyela banwar pitha barete.
The National Sample Survey of India of 1998 actually highlighted this contribution at the national and official level. In the 1980s, N.S. Joda, a renowned scientist, he studied 7 dry states to understand how households depended on common property resources, especially water, fodder, and non-wood forest produce. He suggested the same as the survey, that poor people and particularly women are dependent on common property resources. Number 1, the fuel wood shrubs available from them are used for cooking and heating. Number 2, grass, leaves and shrubs are used as animal fodder. Number 3, bamboo, small timber and palm leaves are used for housing. Number 4, a variety of fruits, vegetables and fish for sustenance, particularly during the lean season. Number 5, common property resources contribute significantly to private property-based farming, as well as to household enterprises. For example, they provide irrigation water, they provide mulch, they provide manure for cultivation, raw materials, and finally, common pastures are used for grazing. In short, dear listeners, common property resources are assets to carry out livelihoods for the poor. We see now how common property resources or assets and related activities can help poor people deal with vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are, as we discussed, vulnerabilities to the risks of an adverse event, for example, recent COVID, and the ability to deal with that event. Shocks may be individual, like death, illness, accident, loss of livestock, or collective, for example, if there's drought or floods, and of course, COVID. The high risk of adverse events and the inability to cope if a shock occurs denotes high vulnerability. There's, of course, regular chronic vulnerability to hunger, the gap between the ability to access food and the minimum consumption needs of the family. Let's take the example of a recent shock of COVID. You see this clip here that I will play. In Chakai block of Bihar, as in many parts of India, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the vulnerabilities and showed how traditional lifestyles could sustain people in the absence of other supports. Markets were shut down during the lockdown. Governments could not supply any food and essential services, and villagers moved back to their alternative traditional sources of food and livelihoods. They engaged their labor in traditional practices like hunting and collecting uncultivated food items from the forest. They worked on their kitchen gardens and farms. There was a shift from pre-COVID days when they had drifted away from the common resources. Let's watch.
लॉकडाउन रे बोले ओना जोखै दा किदाय दा रे आले दो बुरु हिना तालेया मरांग खोय ओना रेगी आड़ा हिना तालेया आर हों बोले मुची उ बदड़ा उ ओना को सब्जी ले जोमे ते बोले आले दो ते नि धरी दो सब ये गी हिना लेया मौज गी हिना आताड़ लेया
अब होड़ पर मा सिदाय को गी बीर बुरु खोय गी चला गान तबन सिदाय अबन जो हपराम को थाय गान तबना उनको हो बीर खोय गी बोले एमान तना प्रोटीन रे को अगुई थे जैसे कि बीर को बन चला खा साहन सकाम अगु साहन सकाम तो बांग ना साहन साथ हुईना माऊ हुईना मताम हुईना एमान त उ अगु कते अब बोले बा उतु कते बन जमे ता ओना अबरम सिदाय हपराम को कमी अगुई थे ना साहन साथ अब नितों को आये बन पंजा अगुई दा जे अब बीर खो नितो बीर बन चला रहा बोले सकाम सकाम साहन सकाम साथे बोले एमान ते उ कना अड़ा गाना को बन अगुई आर उतु कते बन जमे दा.
While studies have shown that poor people are highly dependent on common property resources, they have also shown that women suffer the most because common property resources are lost or degraded or they cannot access them. They have to go long distances for water, to collect fuel wood, to collect food, to collect fodder. They have to walk much longer and struggle much more as they are the main people responsible to do these in most rural families. Environmental degradation of these assets, in summary, make life much harder for women. Alternatives such as migration and wage labor may not be available for them, and they remain home where they manage with what is available. So we see that women suffer the most when common property resources are lost. What then are to Shivaji Chakraborty from Pradhan? He is an expert in this area and identifies activities that we may not even have thought about.
बेसिकली ट्राइबल लाइवलीहुड सिस्टम में अगर देखा जाए तो बहुत अलग अलग तरीके का जो है लाइवलीहुड हम लोग को दिखता है, जिसमें हम लोग को ऑर्डिनरी मतलब जो नॉर्मल रेगुलाइज्ड जो लाइवलीहुड बोलते हैं कि खेती करना, बकरी मुर्गी पालन करना, इस तरीके का लाइवलीहुड तो होता ही है. साथ में बहुत बड़ा एक इम्पैक्ट रहता है फॉरेस्ट या कॉमन प्रॉपर्टी के ऊपर में. तो बेसिकली इसमें से बहुत सारा लाइवलीहुड जैसे हंटिंग या फिशिंग या मतलब फिशिंग मतलब यहाँ पर लोकल फिश कलेक्शन का बात हो रहा है. हंटिंग मतलब जो है जो जंगल या लोकल कॉमन रिसोर्स के अंदर में जो सब मिलता है, जैसे डिफरेंट टाइप ऑफ रॉडेंट्स मतलब जिसको ये लोग अलग अलग चूहा मारना बहुत लोग बोलते हैं. तो उस कंडीशन का जो है लाइवलीहुड को ये लोग स्टिग्माटाइज मतलब हम लोग जो है ग्लोबल वर्ल्ड इसको स्टिग्माटाइज्ड करते जा रहे हैं. तो उस जगह पर जो फोकस करना जरूरी है कि उस तरीके के खान पान के लिए जो है हम लोगों को मतलब एनिमल प्रोटीन का कंजम्पशन जो है वो कहीं ना कहीं ट्राइबल वर्ल्ड में इस तरीके से ही मिलता है.
We assume that all common property resources are often invisible and unknown to outsiders, and many of the activities are not disclosed by villagers to outsiders because of the stigma attached. How often, dear listeners, do we actually notice such activities? We will now watch a series of clips and movies made by young Santhal Adivasis as they tell us about some activities that they engage in as they convert these community or common property resources into outcomes that they value. Let's begin with hunting and see what it means to these young boys.
Aima lekan januar goi katele jom koa. Ona lekate banwar goi ho ale santhal somaj redo adi marang bhumika menaa.
Dear learners, I'm sure you join me in applauding the courage of these young boys when they share their interest in such food, and that you will watch the YouTube video of their recipes. Let's explore what fishing in local rivers and ponds mean, as the fish are sold and consumed locally. It's not just rohu or surma and bekti or the elite fish propagated by markets. Let's map local availabilities and preferences. What are the sources of protein available in the forests? We say Indian diets lack protein. Can we identify and study and encourage diverse sources? Mushrooms from the forest are another source of protein and are being discussed in the women's groups promoted by Pradhan in Chakai. While the families are used to eating this in their earlier generations, they have stopped looking at it as it is what jungle people eat. However, discussing it and placing this back in the livelihoods and food system could have positive impacts. These and many other activities related to livelihoods are associated with shame as being backward, not valued, or thought of as being looked down upon by others in some way or the other. So the local communities also begin to reduce their dependence on these critical activities, and younger generations begin to avoid traditional practices of various kinds. Let's take an example, as you see in the picture, from the vast uncultivated uplands in areas where Adivasis live in Chakai. And look at how weeds are converted into incomes through broom making. Churchuri is native across tropical Asia, Australia, Polynesia. It's a vigorous colonizer of bare ground and can withstand heavy grazing and trampling, and is difficult to eradicate once established. The sharp calluses injure grazing animals and hurt humans, obviously. Yet it is used as a survival strategy to get some cash by older members of the family. Once collected, the grass is used to make brooms to sell, but very suboptimal in terms of income streams. Families somehow manage to sell these in the local markets and add some minimal cash income to their livelihoods. But is this adequate? How can we support the greater use of fallows, uplands, and of commons and forests? We will now watch a clip as an example about tussar, which is a non-wood forest product that is collected by Santhals from the forest and has been commercially sold over centuries, as it is not consumed within the household. It was a dying tradition, viewed as backward. What can be done to modernize it, to link it with scientific knowledge and create new avenues for young Santhals?
To meet barely 60% of the demand for tussar silk. However, when Pradhan started work in this sector, it found no takers among the traditional rearing families. The tradition was long dead and buried. except for some tribal families like those of Shamlal Baske. He lives near the forest and has been rearing silkworms all his life. Every year, as soon as he is through with transplanting paddy in the fields, Shamlal and his wife start the preparations for producing tussar cocoons. This fascinating process spans the entire life cycle of a silkworm. To begin with, Shamlal hunts for seed cocoons in the forest, brings them home and hangs them in garlands.
To read how these interventions link traditional activities with science and markets, please watch the detailed material in your chapter. Dear learners, we now come to the end of this video and will discuss how policies and institutions increase or decrease risk and vulnerability, how these create hurdles or create opportunities for sustainable livelihood systems to flourish. I will only build on the tussar example from the earlier clip to explore this. Tussar silk is a wild silk from cocoons you saw, and investments of the government, the Central Silk Board and state government have prioritized mulberry silk, which is domesticated, and they have neglected tussar silk and non-mulberry wild silks from the forest. Forest laws have created problems for villagers to access cocoons and to nurture the eco-niches in which the host trees, Arjun and Asan in this case, and the cocoons can flourish. Spread of bacterial disease has been identified but neglected by scientists of the SERI biotechnology departments. It's only with the policy push of Pradhan and the Central Silk Board that a new organization, the Tussar Development Foundation, has created a nationwide production boost for tussar and has revived the activity to meet the huge domestic demand for raw silk. So, dear learners, there are many lessons for us for other commodities of the forests that we have discussed, such as gond, chironji, tendu, shellac, etc. A key set of questions then remain for us to explore. How are these rules of ownership and the use of community resources made? Who makes these rules? Is it the users or the owners? Is it the government or the contractors? Or is it market agents or poachers? How are these rules enforced? When someone removes all the fish from the pond or cuts all the leaves or cuts and sells trees for industry and pulp for timber, who sets the penalties? And how is the resource managed? Is it managed by the users, the owners, the poachers? So that how is it prevented from degradation and how is it renewed for future generations? I'll give you three very quick examples. In Vidarbha in Maharashtra, the pond use is governed by a committee and a pankar from the village is hired for its upkeep and equitable distribution. In Ladakh, where glaciers melt in summer and water flows through the canals, it is shared by homes for agriculture. Knowledgeable people are appointed from the village to regulate the flows and it is a respectable position across generations, also settling internal disputes. A classic example, dear learners, is Sukhomajari near Chandigarh. In the 1970s, the dire need for irrigation water led to a huge increase in crop production in a Ford Foundation supported project. It worked as a catalyst in bringing about change in the attitude of people towards hills, of course. It was emphasized that villagers must protect hilly watersheds from grazing and illegal cutting of vegetation if they wanted water in their dams. The villagers, from their part, voluntarily offered to restrain themselves from grazing their cattle. And they protected the catchment area by framing rules to carry headloads of grass from the hilly area to stall feed their animals who were free grazing earlier. Slowly, the bare hill slopes were seen covered with grasses and trees, and the new approach got a name. You will have heard of it before. It's called social fencing. We could also refer to this as collective action by the group of villagers as discussed in the module on group processes. The legal framework also matters, not only governance and management. The laws are important, and in addition, I would like you to think about why laws are important, and I will leave you with a few thoughts on this, using grazing and pasture lands as our example. Laws gave rights to the pastures and grazing lands, as these were designated as wasteland, and their administration was given to the forest or the revenue departments. The government then allotted these wastelands for industrial development and for urban development at low prices. The users, the cattle owners, they lost access to these pastures and ponds or jords, and they were designated wastelands by the legal framework. In the 1970s and onwards, there was a push to give land to the landless, and the commons and grazing lands and jords were allotted to the poor in many states of India. These unproductive lands needed large investments to make them productive, but those investments were not made by the government. Thus, commons were taken away further from one category of poor people and distributed to another category of poor people who could not even use it. At the same time, cattle was distributed by the government in their anti-poverty schemes, but there was no fodder. Grazing pastures were not available and had been converted for industrial use or encroached upon by dominant castes and classes. For instance, in the 1987 drought and the 2015-16 droughts, there were serious casualties of cattle, no fodder, and cattle owners lost tremendously. Dear listeners, systems of governance and laws are not fair to all, and the government may not take opinions of local communities and local people, and they may not even have a voice in decision making. This creates problems. So let us explore this. What roles can policies, institutions, and processes play to make it more helpful to poor people? Or are we accepting that these only create hurdles and obstacles? I now have an exercise for you. Can you think about 3 questions by imagining or recalling a village or a cluster of villages? What are the community or common property resources you recall? What purposes or activities did you notice people depending on these resources for? And what were the activities that made you feel uncomfortable, that you thought that the villagers should stop doing because they are just not acceptable? These are a few references and the videos that you can access. It's available in the chapters. And I request you to go through the details, and our acknowledgements to our funders, particularly for all the clips that you've seen. And finally, this is the list of our partners to make this possible. Thank you, dear listeners, and I hope this was useful.